chart. The pie chart is one of the most basic and popular chart. It's represented by a circular graphic, and each slice represent numbers. And what we're going to do is we're going to create that pie chart, and I'm going to show you how you can change the metrics. So if you remember, we set the properties of the metrics in our widget, and I'm going to show you how you can tie it all up and be able to click to change the metrics and just use different values. I'm also going to show you some basic transition that you can do. As you can see, I'm transitioning when I'm changing the pie chart. There's many different ways we can do the transition. A more complex way is to actually have the slices move according to the data, but this is more of a basic transition that ties really well into React that I want to show you. So let's get started. We've been taking help from Generate React CLI to generate our templates, and if you see in the project I showed you, we have a templates folder, and we're using two templates, the D3 widget and the D3 widget component. And what I've done for this portion of the course, I made some changes in the template, so it's going to be easier for us to work with. First of all, I'm leaving in the comment how it's being created, and you could see it using template name. So whatever name you set, it's going to change it automatically as the token. So I'm just showing you how it was created, so you have that command line. I may change that the property names, we had it as a constant now, or we just hard coded. Now I set it as a state. This way it's going to be easy for us to change metrics. When we're loading the data, we had it as a JSON style, but most of the examples we've been using CSV. So what I've done is I added both options, and one of them is comment out. This way you can just delete whatever you're not using. So if you're using CSV or JSON, you can have it here. And on the chart itself, I'm passing the state of the property metrics instead of hard coding it. The reason that I'm showing you those changes is I want you to really don't be shy to make changes in those templates and create your own template that's based on the environment and how you're running, and just make your life easier. And there's no best practices. You can make up your own best practices, and I'm sure if you're going to be working with D3 a lot, you're going to find certain things that working for you well, and feel free to make changes. At the same as the D3 widget component, I made also some changes. I added the previous height and width already into our component in case we want to use it. I made some changes into our code that we have the JSX code written, because this is really the best approach to take, is to write your JSX instead of writing those elements in D3, because it's easier to intuitively work with it, and we let React do what it does best, which is managing the DOM. But you may find that that the best approach for you is really to work completely, take over the DOM and write those elements with D3 or other libraries. So feel free to make the changes that you want. And then I also added a comment, a use effect for the metrics. For the widget component, so that's the actual chart, let's call it pie chart. And for the pie chart widget, we'll call it also pie chart widget, using the Generate React CLI templates. So we'll call it pie chart widget. Then the next step is we need to make sure we're adding it into our app TSX. If you're using IntelliJ like I do, if you want to open up file quickly, I'm using the Shift, and Shift, you can just start typing the files and that will open it quickly. That's a little tip that can really save you a lot of headache. So I'm going to add the pie chart widget. Now inside my pie chart widget, let's fix the imports. So the component will be pie chart. Component pie chart. We can get rid of this comment. And we're loading CSV. We're not loading JSON, so we can delete this comment. And our component is pie chart, so we set it up here. Then the metrics that we're going to be using is going to be based on a data that I created. What I did is I just created a really simple pie data that has just names A, B, C, D, E, and it has value that if you add the value up, it gives you 100%. So I created 3 properties, name, value, and value 1. And we can even add more if we like. This is just a way so we can switch metrics. So we have two properties for values, value and values 1, and we have the name. And really, this doesn't have to be a CSV. We can just put it as an array. But it's always nicer to kind of have that nice separation. So I'm leaving it as CSV. So we need to change the name to pie.csv. Then we need to set our properties names to match. So we have name and value, which actually match what we're doing here, name and value. We don't need to touch that. So our code is really ready. So our next step is to go into our pie chart. Looks like it didn't import it correctly. So let's fix the imports. Okay. And we need to fix the pie chart helper. We can leave it as chart helper. Just change it here. Pie chart and pie chart helper. And make sure you don't have any errors. This usually takes a little bit of time, depends on how much memory the IDE is using, but just make sure we don't have any errors. Okay, the error disappear. In our pie chart, as I showed you before, we already have our JSX set up for us, so we don't have to repeat this whole process again. We have most of the work really done for us, so now we really can just focus on the chart itself. So for the JSX code, our chart, we can give it a better name. We can call it, instead of just calling it chart, we can call it, give the ID as pie group, so we know exactly what we're working with. In our memorize update callback, we can start working with our pie chart. The first thing we really need to do is we need to set the working area, the bounds of our chart. Since we're working with a circular shape and we're not working with the square as we did before, there is some changes we need to do. We need to calculate the radius of our bound. So normally we kind of use the data in the dimension to do that, but here we need to calculate the radius. So the radius is gonna be the value of the width or the value of the height divided by 2. That's going to be our radius. And the reason is because if the user besides the chart and the height is really high but the width is really small, we need to take the minimum value, because otherwise our chart, our pie chart, is going to exceed the size of our of the bound area that we have. So to do that, I can just use math with the min, and I can pass both properties. I can pass the dimension bound width and the dimension bound height. And what that will do, it will pick the lowest value because we want to make sure that our chart is going to, pie chart will fit. Then we need to divide it by 2 because it's a radius. We need half of that. So now that we have the radius, the next thing is we can start working on drawing our chart. D3 has a property called pie, just like it has line, and we use some of the other ones, so we can use that to do all the calculation. What it expects, the data, so we can use our helper with the accessor to pass how to handle the data. So we can, in TypeScript, we can tell the pie what kind of data to expect. So I can pass in the types data, and that will kind of tell it what to expect. Now if we go into the types data, if you remember, we have it in the widget. It's inside of the widget, the types. So we just need to make sure it's set correctly. It should be name. And we have, if you remember from our pie CSV, we have value and we have value 1. So we need to add that to here. So we have name, value, and value 1. That way our data is set up correctly. Then we can tell the pie how do we want to sort it. So we're not going to be doing any sorting, so we can just pass it as null. And then for the value, we can use our helper and just pass in the y accessor, which holds the value. All right. Then the next thing is we can start dealing with our path. So we can create a constant, let's call it path. And we can use D3 has another method called arc that will actually create for us the path for our pie chart. And the type of arc is going to be pie arc datum, and the type we're going to be passing is going to be types.data. And you can see here I'm trying not to do a lot of type ignore, so it can really check our data, and this is always the preferred way. And to me, my rule of thumb is if I have to do some crazy casting, and the code really become too complex, then I'll use the ignore. But if it's a simple thing, it's always better to to put the type correctly, because that's the whole reason why we're using TypeScript. So the inner radius, we're going to pass as 0, the inner, because we're starting from 0, and then the outer, that would be the size of our radius. We already calculated that as our radius that we took from our calculation. And now that we have the path, we can create the pie data. So I'm going to create a constant, and let's call it pie data. That what it is we're going to use the function of the pie we created, and we're going to pass the property of the data, and that will generate our path data using the value accessor. And now to really create the arches for us, we can select the pie group that we created. So if you remember in our JSX code, we created the pie group. So we want to attach it to a pie group. Where'd it go? Okay. And here what we're going to do is we're going to create those arches. So I'm going to do select all arches, that we're going to create them once they added to the once we enter into the DOM. The data we're going to be using is going to be the pie data we set up, and we need to handle that once the element entered the DOM. And what we're going to be doing, we're going to append a G group element, and we'll give it an attribute to match the arc that we're going to be reusing, and then we need to use a fill. Now here it becomes interesting. If we can create an array of different colors for a fill, and we kind of saw when we talked about color spaces how you can use how to match the theme of colors. But I want to introduce you to something that D3 has built into. Is D3 has all those color scales that we can use, and those color scales really create for us an array of colors, and we can use that instead of creating our own array just for simplicity. And you can look into that in D3. There's a lot of them that they built into that, and it really can make our life easy. So I'm going to use the fill, and inside of the fill we're going to use the data, and our data is going to be the types data, and then we can create our inline method to return the scale. Okay, so we need to create the scale. So if I'm going into our helper, you can see, first of all, we're not dealing with date, so I can delete this comment. You can see that our template include two scales, but we're not using the X scale or the Y scale. It's not needed. Delete those scales, and what we're going to do is we're going to create a color scale. So we'll use D3, and then we're going to use scale ordinal, and just like any other scale, we need to set our domain and set our range. In our domain, what we need to do is we need to use our X accessor, which is those name, as our domain, because we're going to be running between those. Our Pi is going to be using those different names, and we can use that as our range. So we can call D3 and extend, and then pass our data, and then we can use our helper that it's already set up for our here, and pass in the X accessor, which will give the names, and we need to cast that as a string. So it's gonna probably it needs unknown. Yeah, it needs unknown and the string for our domain, and then for our range, which would be an array, we can just you could see all the different schemas. We have different schemas, dark, accent, blue. We have all those different schema. Let's use the category 10, but you can play around with them and see the different colors. And we can actually even create different color scales and switch them, so you can really play around with that. Go back to the pie chart, and now we can return the scales we created. So we're going to call the scales color scales, and then we're going to pass the data name, and that needs to be a type string, so we need to cast it, and the whole scale is going to return a color of type string, and we probably need to add unknown again. Okay, so now we're creating our color based on the color scale. And now that we have the arc, we can actually use it. So we can take our arch, and we can append it as a type path, and then we need to set the attribute for the data as our path. So that will draw it on the screen. The other thing we need to do is at the memorize draw callback, the default code is just removing everything, so we don't need that. We don't need to remove everything from the div because we'll deal with the resizing after we see our chart, and it wants us to update the dependencies. Okay. Now, if you go back into our local host, you can see we have our pie drawn. But take a look, it's being drawn outside of the screen. And that's happening because if you look at our JSX code, our pie group, we need to use a translate. And we rather do it here than using D3 with the selector. And the reason is that when we're gonna do resize, we want it, we want React to be in charge of the DOM instead of D3 in this scenario. So what we can do, we can just add the style right on the code. Those translate method, they sometimes get really complicated with the code. So first of all, we need two brackets, and the way that I like to do it is it's better to kind of break it down into different lines, and this way it's easier to really see what's happening. Otherwise the code, it's really easy to make mistakes. So when we're doing the translate, easy way to do it, you see if I break it like that, and then I can put the properties for the top left and the top here as those two properties, it's much cleaner and easier to read. For the top left, what we need to do is we need to add the margins. So we need the props dimension margin left, okay, and then we need to add the size of the pie divided by 2. So if you remember, we calculated before the size of the pie inside of our memorize update callback. So I can just take that calculation from there, and if I put it above the return, it's going to recalculate it on every time it needs to render. So it's called pie size. So I'm not dividing by 2, I'm just getting the whole pie size. And then what I can do is I can add half the pie size to my left side. So it's gonna give me, it's gonna position it right on the left corner. Don't forget the pixel because we're in a style. And we can use the same half pie size divided by 2 to position it on the top. So we need to here we go. To close the bracket, close the tags. Actually, we don't need the bracket here. We can just close it like that. Okay, now let's check it out. Here we go. If you refresh localhost, we got our pie drawn out. But now the next step is if I'm resizing it, look what's happening. It's positioning it correctly, but it's not resizing my pie. So we need to add some code to handle the resizing of the pie. To handle the resizing, we already have the useEffect hook that take care of the checking the changes. The only thing we really need to do is we're adding the arch and those pie slices into our pie group, and we need to remove them when there's a resize event. So we already have the method ready. So the memorize draw callback is ready, and we just need to remove. We don't want to remove all the div element. We just want to remove the pie group div element. So we'll select the pie group, and we're going to select using the wildcard. So it's going to select all the elements inside, and we're going to remove them. and that's going to get called according to our use effect. It's going to get called every time there's a resize event. So let's take a look if it's working. If I'm going back to my local host and I'm going to resize, take a look. Now it's really resizing it based on the width and the height. So you can see if I'm changing the height but not touching the width, it's going by the minimum size, so it's going to fit inside of our chart. Now that we have a basic pie chart ready, we want to add a button to be able to kind of switch between the metrics. The Create React app must-have library template project that I created for you already have built-in Material UI, so we can use Material UI to create some code that will, with the button that can handle that. So inside of our pie chart widget, we can add another tag, open and close tag. So we have to do it if we want to use the conditional statements. And then we can add a button. So we can use a button, and in Material UI we can use a variant. So if we use a variant, and you can see the option that it gives us, we can put a contained variant with the color, and also the color we can either inherit. I'm going to use the secondary color, and now we can handle an on-click event. So an on-click, what we'll do is we're going to call a method that will change the metrics. So let's call that method change metric handler, and let's close that tag. And I'm closing, actually we don't want to close the button because we want to give it a name that will show on the button. That's how we do it in Material UI. And let's call it change metric. So this code will create a button for us, and now we can handle changing the metrics. So we can create it here. Let's call it constant change metric handler. I hope I don't have a typo. And we're doing an inline with a fat arrow. And what we can do is we can create a new value to change the value. What we already have the properties names. If you look at the top, we have the property names as a state, so we can check the state. So if our property names first would be, right, the property names is made out of a name and a value. So we want to take the second property on the array. So if the property name second property, which is the value, if it's equal to value, then we want to set it as value 1. Otherwise, we want to set it as value. That way, it's just going to switch between value and value 1. And let's just remind you, if you look at the pie, we have value and value 1 with different values. So that way, we're just going to be switching between them. You can put more, but 2 is just enough to kind of make the case and show you how it's working. And then we need to set the properties, set name properties. No, I think I call it property name. How do I call it? Let's see. Properties name. So we can add into a use state a set property names method, so we can update. And now we can pass the new value. And that's going to switch the data. This code is going to, let's see what's complaining. It doesn't need the curly bracket. You can just put quotes. Now it's going to, if you go back to our, let's see first that we don't have any errors. it's complaining about the import. It wants the button to be imported before the type. So we can just let it handle it, fix it on its own, the orders. Okay, now we don't have an error. Now if I'm gonna refresh, I should be seeing that button added to the screen. It's look like it's complaining because I'm passing a string instead of an array. Yeah, take a look here at the property names. We need to pass an array, not a string, because we have the array is made up of the two properties. So it's the name and it's the value. Let's take a look. Okay, here we go. So we have a change metrics. Once I click it, really nothing happened because we need to make sure that we have a hook. So if you go back into the pie chart, you can see that our template left us a hook. Remember I showed it to you? So we have a hook there that what we can do is we can listen to that change of the property names, and if there's a change of the property names, we want to handle it just like how we handle a change of width and height on our chart. So once we uncomment that code, you could see it's making the changes for us because it's changing the metrics, but it's changing it right away, and we may want to put some transition. If you remember the code, I put some, you saw there's a transition. So to handle the transition, what we need to do is we can actually put some code that every time that we're changing the metrics, we put a transition. And we can do it at our memorize drawback. So if you go to the memorize drawback code, we can just add some logic there to handle that. What we need to do is we need to, as I said, there's few ways to kind of go about it, but what we can do, a simple way to do is just to use the CSS style. So we can select our pie group. So let's do, no, we can do this. We can actually create a variable. Let's call it constant pie group, and that's going to equal our pie group. And then we can handle the animation. We can call the pie group, and then we can set the style. So we can set our style to opacity of 0. So what we're doing here is every time when we recreate our screen, we set the opacity of our pie group to 0. This way it won't display anything. And only after we calculate all the data and everything is ready and our arch and path, everything is got ready and got drawn, then we can call our pie group, and then we can set a transition, and we can use a method to do a delay. Let's give it, for example, 200 milliseconds. And after the delay, we can set back our opacity to 1. Go back to localhost and refresh. You could see that it's giving us this neat little fade in effect when it's changing the metrics.